What happens when an ally doubts your courage, your strength, even your very ability to fight? During World War II, Soviet generals believed America was all industry and no grit factories, instead of fighters, soldiers too soft for the brutality of war. For 3 years, they carried the weight of the Eastern Front, bleeding millions, while America delayed the Second Front. To the Soviets, D-Day was America's last chance to prove it wasn't just talk. On the 6th of June, year 1944, amid the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, doubt met determination, and the result changed not only the war, but the way the Soviets saw American power forever. This is the story of how Soviet leaders went from questioning American military capabilities to witnessing firsthand the devastating effectiveness of American combat power. It is a story born from broken promises and diplomatic frustration, hardened by years of mistrust, and ending in a reluctant respect that would reshape the world's balance of power. On the 6th of June, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history was about to reveal a truth the Soviets had never believed, that American soldiers were far more capable than they imagined. But to grasp why Moscow doubted them so deeply, we first need to step back into the tense middle years of the war, when Allied unity was anything but certain. By 1943, the Soviet Union had been through hell. They had watched entire cities starve, fought at Stalingrad until the Volga ran red with blood, and buried millions of their own people in the frozen earth. To them, this was war, endless sacrifice, unthinkable suffering, and survival measured in inches of land. So, when they looked westward at their American allies, they saw something entirely different. Yes, America had industry, endless tanks, trucks, and planes, but could a nation that had never been invaded, never starved, never burned alive in its own capital, truly understand what it took to break the Wehrmacht? Reports from Soviet intelligence painted an unflattering picture. US. Training camps filled with recreation facilities, soldiers eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in warm barracks, and even enjoying movies. To battle-hardened Soviet commanders who had watched boys become men in the ashes of Kursk, these parade ground soldiers seemed laughably soft. Marshal Zhukov himself doubted America's willpower, wondering if soldiers raised in comfort could endure nights in frozen foxholes or fight on through waves of their comrades being slaughtered. Others sneered at what they called America's industrial approach to war. Endless machines, precise planning, careful logistics. To the Soviets, this looked less like courage and more like fear of sacrifice. And behind the skepticism was bitterness. Stalin had begged for a second front since 1941, but the promise kept slipping 1942, then 1943, finally 1944. Each delay deepened Soviet suspicion. Were the Allies waiting for the Red Army to bleed Germany dry before swooping in for the glory? To Soviet eyes, America wasn't just untested, it might be unwilling. This was the heart of Soviet doubt. They believed only those who had suffered could truly fight. And until the 6th of June, 1944, America hadn't suffered at all. To the Soviets, war was measured in blood. To the Americans, it was measured in calculation. While the Red Army learned to win by enduring unimaginable losses, the US military believed victory came from preparation, firepower, and efficiency. It wasn't about throwing men into the grinder, it was about making sure those men had everything they needed to win. This was the American way. Build a supply chain so vast it reached across oceans. Ensure every rifleman had food, ammo, and medicine, and overwhelm the enemy not with sheer numbers, but with coordination. Where Soviet generals spoke of sacrifice, American planners spoke of logistics. Where Stalin's commanders accepted catastrophic casualties as inevitable, US leaders insisted that smart planning could save lives. To Soviet eyes, this looked like weakness. They called it naive, even cowardly. How could soldiers trained in safety and comfort, fed regularly, transported in trucks instead of marching, supported by endless machines, stand against the hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht? But what the Soviets misunderstood was that America's comfort wasn't softness, it was strategy. The United States had turned its factories into an arsenal, producing more planes, tanks, and ships than Germany and Japan combined. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about precision. Every bullet had a supply line behind it. Every soldier had a system, ensuring he could fight again tomorrow. The Americans also fought with a different mindset. They valued individual initiative on the battlefield. A sergeant could adapt, a squad could improvise, and junior officers were encouraged to make bold decisions. This flexibility, alien to Soviet doctrine, would prove crucial when plans fell apart under fire. So while the Soviets prepared to grind Germany down through sheer endurance, the Americans were preparing to fight a war of movement, technology, and overwhelming coordination. To the Red Army, it looked soft. On D-Day, it would prove anything but. The morning of the 6th of June, 1944, was more than an invasion. It was a trial by fire, not just against Hitler's fortress Europe, but against Soviet doubt. As the first landing craft approached Normandy, German machine guns opened up. Men were cut down before their boots even touched sand. At Omaha Beach, the sea itself turned red. Waves of soldiers drowned under the weight of their packs. Entire companies vanished in minutes. Radios crackled with panic. We're pinned down. We can't advance. For a moment, it seemed the Soviets had been right. The Americans were facing their first true encounter with Germany's veterans, and they were being slaughtered. Soviet planners watching from afar likely imagined Omaha ending in disaster, confirming every suspicion of weakness. But something happened in that chaos. Soldiers who had never seen combat crawled forward anyway. Rangers scaled the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, clinging to ropes as grenades rained down. Infantry units regrouped under relentless fire, improvising when their officers were killed. Engineers tore through barbed wire under shell fire, carving paths for the men behind them. The Americans didn't retreat. They adapted, they improvised, they endured. By afternoon, positions that had seemed impregnable just hours earlier were falling one by one. German commanders were stunned. They'd expected confusion, collapse, maybe even retreat. Instead, they found an enemy that combined raw courage with something they hadn't seen before: seamless coordination. Artillery, air power, armor, and infantry all moved as one crushing machine. The Soviets had measured strength by suffering. The Americans proved that strength could also come from precision, flexibility, and the refusal to break under pressure. By nightfall, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. The parade ground soldiers mocked in Moscow had stormed Hitler's fortress and won. When news of Normandy reached Moscow, the mood shifted from wary anticipation to stunned disbelief. Reports from German officers themselves described American units fighting with a discipline and ingenuity that rivaled anything on the Eastern Front. For Soviet commanders who had written the Americans off as soft, this was a revelation. The soldiers they had imagined collapsing at the first taste of real combat had instead stormed ashore against impossible odds, regrouped under fire, and crushed Hitler's vaunted coastal defenses in a single day. Marshal Zhukov, the hero of Stalingrad, admitted privately that he had underestimated them. Soviet intelligence briefings, once mocking American parade ground troops, now spoke of units that combined firepower, flexibility, and coordination with startling effectiveness. These were not pampered recruits, they were hardened fighters forged in a single bloody day. The Red Army adjusted immediately. Operation Bagration, their massive summer offensive, was launched just weeks later, timed to prevent German divisions from reinforcing France. For the first time, Soviet strategy assumed that the Americans could be counted on to sustain a major campaign against Germany's best troops. But the implications went deeper. The Soviets realized that America's way of war logistics, precision, overwhelming coordination was not weakness, but a new kind of strength. They had built a machine of war that could fight across oceans, sustain millions of men, and strike with devastating efficiency, all while keeping casualties far lower than the Soviet model of attrition. In Moscow, respect replaced mockery. But it was a wary respect, because if America could do this to Germany, what might it one day do to the Soviet Union? The beaches of Normandy were not just a battlefield. They were a proving ground, where America's reputation, Soviet doubts, and the future of the world all collided in one day of fire and blood. For the Soviets, respect did not come easily. They had carried the war through suffering beyond imagination, bearing millions of their sons and daughters to stop Hitler. To them, only pain forged true warriors. But at Normandy, they saw something different. Not warriors shaped by hunger and desperation, but by training, technology, and an unshakable will to adapt under pressure. That respect changed everything. It turned Moscow's skepticism into caution. It forced Soviet generals to accept that the Americans were not just allies of convenience, but a power that could rival them in any future war. and it set the stage for the uneasy balance that would define the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War. The irony is powerful. On the 6th of June, 1944, America did not just prove itself to Germany. It proved itself to its most skeptical ally. The boys from Kansas wheat fields, Texas ranches, and California towns had written their strength into the sand of Normandy, showing the world that American power was more than machines. It was men who refused to break. Doubt had turned to respect, and that respect didn't just help win a war. It redrew the map of power for generations.